section, we're going to be talking about all things epoxy resin. But first, what exactly is epoxy resin? I wish I knew this from the top of my head, but I'm going to have to read this to you. Epoxy resins are a class of prepolymers and polymers that, when reacted with hardeners, are curing agents, and they form a strong, durable substance. It is a two-component material consisting of epoxy resins and hardeners. Epoxy resin is epoxy adhesive in its liquid form. For any epoxy, there are two primary parts: the resin and the curing agent. So that is why epoxy resin, if you see it, always has a part A and a part B. When the resin and the curing agent react together, the hardening process occurs. There are many different types of epoxy resin out on the market right now. So let's go over some of the different ones, talk about them so that you are an epoxy resin pro. I'm all about trying out all of the different resins, so I feel like I pretty much have like a little bit of everything. With epoxy resin, there's lots of different types. We've got UV resin, we've got our standard resins, fast setting epoxies. We've also got medium viscosity, thin viscosity. It can be a little overwhelming. So what does it all mean? We're gonna go through each of these different categories and talk about them. The first one is our UV resin. We aren't going to be really using UV resin during this course, but I just wanted to talk about it. UV resin comes in just one part as opposed to the other ones, and it does not cure on its own. It does need a UV light in order to fully cure. UV resin is something that you would use for silicone molds, acrylic blanks. I do use them sometimes on my tumblers for setting embellishments, setting my tumbler toppers, different things like that. But again, for this course, we're not going to be really using any UV resin. I just want to make sure we had a little bit of a chitty chat about it. Next, we have our standard epoxy resin. This is artist resin from Counterculture. Counterculture's epoxy is my absolute favorite. I will refer to them a lot on here. That's the epoxy I will be using throughout this course. You have some other brands as well that I will show you, but this one is my absolute favorite, and that's their artist resin. The best one for beginning, I would say though, would be Illuminite. I'm sorry if I said that wrong. It's the Amazing Clear Cast. You can actually get this at craft stores. Hobby Lobby has it, Michael's, Joann, pretty sure all of them have it. It's a really great, inexpensive epoxy resin to start out with. Is it my favorite one? No. But is it great when you're first starting off? Yes. Something that you really need to pay attention to when you purchase your resin is your mixing ratios. The majority of resins are going to be a 1-to-1 ratio. So if you are needing 1 ounce of epoxy, then you would want to do half an ounce of part A and half an ounce of part B. There are some epoxy resins on the market though that go off of weight, or there are some that are different ratios, like a 2-to-1 ratio. So make sure you're paying attention to the mixing directions. Counterculture resin is a 1-to-1 ratio, and so is the Illuminate one. A good way to know if it's not a 1-to-1 ratio is you'll notice that one of the bottles is double the size of the other. So if you buy epoxy resin and one of your parts is a lot bigger than the other part, then there's a really good chance you have a 2-to-1 ratio. But no matter what, always check it just to double check. Because if your ratios are incorrect, that's not going to mix correctly, it's not going to cure correctly, and you're just going to run into all sorts of problems. So just make sure you double check that beforehand. With your standard epoxies, you are going to have a work time of about 30 to 40 minutes before it starts that curing process. You're first starting, just a standard non-fast setting epoxy is going to be your best type of epoxy to start with. Definitely get yourself some of just regular standard artist resin epoxy. Wait, you don't have to worry about running out of time or feeling rushed at all. Also, whenever I'm using this kind of epoxy, I want to make sure that it's on my turner for at least 5 to 6 hours before I turn off my turner. Because a really important thing to know about epoxy resin is that it is self-leveling, which is why we need to have it on the turner. That way our epoxy stays level. And since this is a slower cure, if you turn your turner off too soon, then you'll notice on the bottom of your tumbler, all of your epoxy resin will pool right there, and then you'll just have like a big clump and the top will be thinned. So you want to make sure that you are turning your tumbler turner long enough. We can go over all of that more later, but just be aware that's how these ones are. Another type of epoxy resin that you will see is that there's different consistencies. You'll notice that there might be some medium viscosity or a thin viscosity. I personally don't ever really use thin viscosity. With tumblers, you'll typically always be working with medium viscosity or just standard epoxy. What exactly does medium viscosity mean? Medium viscosity resin is thinner than your standard artist resin. So because of that, medium viscosity is great when you're making tumblers with like alcohol inks. It's because you're going to get the most movement with the medium viscosity. If I'm just doing a standard glitter tumbler, you don't really need the medium viscosity. You can definitely use it for that. Medium viscosity is mainly for tumblers where you're wanting some movement with them. While I have these tubs out here, I did also want to point out that sometimes you may notice that your part B, it is yellow or it turns yellow. It may, when you first get it, it could not be. And then eventually, oh no, it's yellow. Don't worry, you're fine. When you mix these, it's crazy. It's clear. It's not yellow. I've been making tumblers for a few years now and I've yet to have any of my epoxy turn yellow. So don't be scared of that. Totally normal. One way though to make sure your epoxy doesn't do this is older, so it's the longer you have it, the more it does that. But you always want to make sure you store your epoxy in a cool, dry, dark place. Don't leave it out in the sun or in the window. I store mine like under a table in the corner of my craft room where the sun does not ever touch it. Now we're going to talk about my favorite kind of epoxy, fast setting epoxy. What is fast set epoxy? Just like what the name says, it's epoxy that sets fast. Because it sets fast though, your work time is a lot lower. As we talked about with the artist resin and your standard epoxies, you're going to have about 40 minutes of work time. With this epoxy, that drops down to about 15 minutes. Also, this one, it cures to the touch in 2 hours, as opposed to, I would say, like 8 to 10. It is fully cured in 24 hours, as opposed to 48 to 72 hours. This one though, again, I would say only use this one if you are feeling comfortable with your tumbler making. Or the fast setting epoxy is really nice to have if you are putting your glitter on with the epoxy method, which we'll be talking all about that. So if you're like, what's the epoxy method? Don't worry, we'll get to that. Also, you may have noticed that I have some big jugs of epoxy resin and then some little ones. Whenever you buy resin, whether like no matter what brand, like here's, again, I have a bunch of different ones, like here's some Speedy Petey. Counterculture again is my absolute favorite though. Always buy the smallest bottles first. Plus look how cute these are. That way you can try it, make sure it works for you before you invest, because these cost a lot more than these do. And I want to make sure that you like these before you invest in the bigger sizes. The bigger sizes are really nice to have those. That way you don't feel like you're buying epoxy every 5 minutes. Also, you get a lot more for your money with these. Something with epoxy resin though, is where you live can greatly affect your resin and how it cures. If you live in a place that is more humid or more dry or hot or cold, all of those different factors will affect your resin and the curing process. I'm in Utah, so for me, this one works amazing, but there are some places where this one might not work as well. Just try them all out and see which one you like the best. I totally understand that buying epoxy resin can be a little confusing and a little overwhelming because of the fact that there are so many different options. So I've gone over all of the different types of resin that there are, but most importantly, let's talk about what specific key things you are looking for when you buy your resin. So when you're starting your tumblers and you think, oh, I need to buy some epoxy resin, Oh, it would be so nice if it was just like, okay, just go buy any of the resins. Unfortunately, no, there are certain things that you need to make sure that you look for, especially when you're doing resin on a project like a tumbler that somebody is going to be using for something that they're going to be like consuming or drinking. There is no one size fits all. There is certain things that you will want to look for in whatever epoxy resin you choose to use. So because of that, we want to make sure we're using the safest possible resin for our customers and for ourselves. Make sure you are getting a resin that is food safe. Not all epoxy resin is food safe, so make sure you're checking the label for that. Another thing you want to look at with your epoxy resin is VOC. VOC is short for volatile organic compounds. What does that mean? Chemical compounds with high vapor pressure or the ability to evaporate easily are called VOCs, or volatile organic compounds. For example, isopropyl alcohol is a form of a VOC. So historically, epoxy resins had VOCs in them. And once epoxy resins were applied, the VOCs would be released into the air for a few hours while they were curing, basically. It does gradually slow down. Those VOCs could be released for like a few days to a few weeks, which, I mean, I don't know about you. I don't want to be breathing that in. I don't want my family to be breathing that in. I don't want my customers to have that. So basically, VOC equals bad. No. With your epoxy resins, we always want to make sure we find one that is low to no VOCs. I did go over a lot of this in my safety course, but I just want to reiterate it just to make sure I give you all of the correct information on it. There is no 100% safe epoxy resin. I wish that there was. I wish I could say, use this one and you'll never have any issues. There's just not. No matter what epoxy you use, it's a chemical. There's no way to change that. Even if it says no VOCs, it's still a chemical. No VOCs does not equal 100% safe. So statements like low VOC or safe for home use, those are putting emphasis on the volatile compounds that are in there, which yes, we don't want that stuff like that. Yeah, we don't want that. So the no or the low, yeah, that is a good thing, but it does not mean that VOC free is still okay and safe to breathe in. There are still chemicals in epoxy resin that are harmful for your respiratory system, but they're not considered VOCs because they're not part of that category. But they aren't included as a VOC because they are part of the chemical reaction. So when looking for your resin, make sure it is low to no VOC, but still remember it's still a chemical and we want to be safe. So if you haven't gone through the safety course, I go a lot more into detail about all of those things. So make sure you go back and check out the safety course. I know it's not the most exciting thing in the world, but it's so important. So please make sure you have done that. I'm never going to tell you like, you have to do this, you have to do that. I want you to do what you're the most comfortable with. I just want to make sure that you go into it knowing all of the information possible. I don't want to scare you at all because this is definitely safe to work with as long as it's used correctly. I promise it's not scary. Like, I'm allergic to it and I still use it because I know how to use it safely and appropriately, so I don't have issues. Some other things you want to make sure that you look for with epoxy resin is you want to make sure that it is heat resistant. We don't want any of our epoxy melting. That it is made for tumblers or craft usage. There are some epoxy resins that are specifically just for like countertops, flooring, like adhesives and different things like that. So make sure you're getting like an artist epoxy resin. So just to recap, your key things you're wanting to look for are low to no VOCs, preferably no VOCs. Heat resistant, I would say heat resistant up to at least 500 degrees. And another really important one is making sure that it's FDA compliant and that it's food safe, because again, we're making tumblers with beverages that people will be consuming. And I'm pretty sure your customers or you don't want to be consuming something that is with non-food safe epoxy. So make sure you're using something that is food safe. Thankfully, Counterculture's epoxies fall under all of those categories, so you know you're good to go with this one. If you ever have any questions about a certain epoxy or a brand, or if you can use this kind, reach out and ask me, and I am happy to help you the best that I can. Because I want to make sure that you're using the correct epoxy so that you can get the absolute best results. So now that we know about like buying your resin, what are some important tips to know about epoxy resin? Talked a little bit about working time. So depending on what type of resin that you're working with, if you're doing just a standard epoxy resin, like a non-fast setting epoxy, you're gonna have about, let's say like 35 to 45 minutes of working time, because a lot of that depends on your environment that you're working in. The cooler your resin is, the longer your working time is going to be. The warmer your room is and the warmer your resin is, the shorter your working time is. A lot of times people will heat up one of their parts of their resin, typically the part A, because it's a lot thicker than the part B is. I personally try not to do that too much just because that will reduce your working time. So just keep that in mind. Let's just say if your room temperature is about, I don't know, about 72 degrees, I would say you probably have about 30 to 45 minutes of working time. Next, let's talk about curing times. As you make tumblers and you see that beautiful shiny tumbler turning, you will completely understand, if you haven't done one yet, how much you just want to touch it. If you know, you know. But when can you? Don't do it too soon. You're gonna leave fingerprints on your tumbler if you do it too soon. You wanna make sure you give it enough time for curing. You're gonna hear a few different things. Cure to the touch and fully cured. With cure to the touch, that does not mean you can pull it off, just do like whatever you want with it. Might still be a little bit tacky, a little bit sticky in some spots. It's cured, so your epoxy is not wet and it's not going to move, but it's not fully cured yet. Fully cured is it's completely cured. Then you can touch it, rub it, do whatever you want, roll it on the table. Everything is cured. It's not sticky at all. You don't have to worry about anything sticking to that surface. It's smooth, it's done. You are good to go. Why is it important to know these two things? How long do each of these take? Well, if you're using a regular like artist resin epoxy, your cure to the touch time is going to be about 8 to 12 hours. If you're using like a fast setting epoxy, it'd be about 90 minutes to 2 hours. Again, depending on your environment. The warmer your room is, the faster it's going to cure. So it really all depends. In the summertime, you're going to notice that your tumblers cure a lot faster than they do in the winter time. Always make sure you're adjusting accordingly. Now, something that is really, really, really vital, and I want you to remember this, is if you are making tumblers for customers, something that I always go off of, like one of the biggest rules is once it's fully cured, wait to ship 72 hours. Because again, remember, epoxy resin, it is a chemical and it's got a chemical reaction, and things that have a chemical reaction can continue having a chemical reaction. I've had tumblers where they've felt fully cured and then I had like a dispersion color, or I used Armor R or just one of my different colorants, and it didn't mix correctly with my resin, and it's actually popped up out of my epoxy resin and it's been wet and got paint everywhere. Thankfully, I waited that 72 hours to ship it to my customer, but it was like repelling all of the epoxy that I did. Now, if I just immediately sent it to the customer after that 24-hour fully cured time, then my customer would have gotten a cup that was completely covered in white paint, and that would have been no good at all. So make sure you are giving your tumbler time to fully cure and just to fully set. I know that we get excited and anxious, we're ready to start using it right away. Wait 72 hours before you use the cup. Just trust me, make sure that it is good, and I want you guys to be as safe and keep your customers as safe as possible. Another thing that we talked about is heat resistant. Again, I would go for something that is heat resistant to about like 500 degrees. Now, with any epoxy resin, it doesn't matter what brand it is, you need to avoid prolonged exposure to heat. don't put it in the oven. I mean, just because it's heat resistant up to 500 degrees does not mean, oh, I can put this in the oven. Don't put it in the oven. Don't leave it out in the hot sun on a summer day in your car for a really long time, because no matter what, and again, this is all epoxy resins. Does not matter the brand. It's all of them. Prolonged exposure will cause your epoxy resin to amber, to yellow, and lose its pretty clear shine. The heat resistant part of it does not mean that it's never going to yellow unless it gets over 500 degrees. The reason that we want heat resistant epoxy is not necessarily for the heat resistant part of it. Heat resistant epoxy is a lot more durable. If you use epoxy resin that is not designed for heat resistance, if it is exposed to high heat, then the epoxy resin can soften and then it'll reharden, and then you'll end up again with, it'll be all distorted and bumpy. And also you'll lose that shine, beautiful epoxy resin shine. Epoxy resin, it can melt at high heats. So these particular ones are heat resistant up to 500 degrees. Because of that, basically what that means is that these would need to get up to 500 degrees before they melted. So if it is a warm day outside and you're using your cup outside, you don't have to worry about your cup melting. That would be awful. I can't even imagine. Like, whew. Luckily, I've never heard of anybody having their tumbler like melting on them. So yeah, but make sure it's heat resistant. Some other things with epoxy resin that you might run into is something called flash curing. What is that? Too much heat causes epoxy resin to flash cure. As epoxy resin cures, it gets hot. Sometimes when you're working with resin, you might notice like your little mixing cup, it starts warming up and it's starting to feel hot. It's that chemical reaction. It's heating up basically as those react, and that's what's causing it to harden. Because of that, if your epoxy resin is too hot when you mix it, it's gonna flash cure, where it just cures like instantly basically. And you'll notice that as you're mixing it, it gets really big and it gets really clumpy all of a sudden, and it's really warm and it's gloopy, and you're just gonna be like, what in the world? Trust me, it happens to everybody. I still have it happen every once in a while, so it doesn't matter how long you've been making tumblers or working with resin. Everybody at some point will have flash curing. It's just part of it, and it's okay. If it happens to you, that's fine. Just mix a new batch. It happens to everybody. Something important though is if it is flash curing, don't just throw it away in the garbage, because like I said, it's gonna be warm and it's gonna kind of heat up. If that ever happens, I just set it aside on my table. Also, another thing, I swear, please don't be afraid of epoxy resin. I'm worried I'm gonna tell you all these things and you're gonna be like, I don't wanna work with it. You may even notice that it kind of, some smoke comes out of it. It's not gonna light on fire, I promise. Again, it's just because it's really warm and it's kind of like steaming and there's smoke coming out of it, but it's not gonna light on fire, I promise. If it does flash cure, just set it on the side, set it somewhere where it's just fine and it can continue doing its little thing, and once it's fully cured, then you can throw it away. One way though to reduce flash curing is making sure that you store your resin correctly. Remember, we always want to store it in a cool, dry, dark place. That way it stays at room temperature. We don't want to leave it out in the sun. We don't want to just leave them somewhere it'll get warm all the time. Sometimes you will hear that people will warm up their part A since it's a lot thicker. Just be aware that that can cause flash curing if you heat it up too much. So just make sure if you do heat up one of your parts that you are mindful to not make it too warm. You're just thin it out just a little bit. I personally don't heat up any of my parts just because I don't want to deal with flash curing. I actually don't remember the last time I had my epoxy flash cure because I don't do that. I also do work in my basement though, so it's pretty cool down here, which helps a lot. Again though, just remember, flash curing, it does not happen all of the time. It's a very rare occurrence. Don't be afraid of epoxy resin. The other thing with epoxy resin is that it does produce bubbles. When mixing your resin, you'll get little micro bubbles. Sometimes you do get lucky and you don't really get any bubbles, or you barely get any. And there's other times where you mix and you feel like it is bubble city in there, and that's okay. Thankfully, it is really easy to pop your bubbles. I do have another section. We're going to be talking all about the different heat sources, different ways to pop your air bubbles. So we're going to get into that as well. But just be aware that epoxy resin, it produces bubbles. We're also going to go over mixing epoxy resin. And when we go over that, I will show you some different tools that you can use to reduce the amount of bubbles that you get. Also remember that with resin, kind of going back to the heat stuff, whatever your work environment is, you can have your room temperature be between about, I would say between 70 to 75 degrees. That is the ideal temperature for resins to work. If it is a lot colder, which again, in the winter time, you might run into this, having a space heater in your room definitely makes a big difference. I have a little one that I use when it's really cold in here. Now, cold temperatures don't affect cured resin at all. So that's not something that once your resin is cured, your room temperature and all of that, you're fine. It doesn't affect it in any way. But that doesn't mean that you can put it in the freezer. Always make sure it stays above freezing temperature though. Now that we've talked about the different type of epoxy resins, another thing I wanted to go over with is bottles to hold your resin. Now you can definitely use the bottles that it comes in, especially if you buy one of these where it's like one of the smaller bottles, even like this size. These are pretty easy to pour in. When you start getting into like the bigger gallon sizes, this is really hard to pour into a little cup and be in control of how much is coming out. So I just wanted to go over quickly some different options of containers that you can use for your epoxy resin. Now remember, you want one container for your part A and a different container for your part B. You don't want to put these together in whatever bottle you pick, otherwise they will cure. Also make sure you label your bottles so you don't accidentally put your part A in your part B. I may or may not have accidentally done that a few times. So if that happens to you, just know you're in good company, and it happens to all of us. This is something that I have very much tried all of the different options that are out there, and I definitely have thoughts on what works best for me. Again, you need to find out what works best for you. So just because the one that's my favorite is my favorite does not mean it's going to be your favorite. So that's why I wanted to make sure I showed you the different options so that you could pick which one is going to work the best for you. Before I get into these bottles though, I quickly just wanted to mention that with the gallon size, you are able to get pumps. That way you could just screw a pump into this bottle and pump it into your little mixing cup. This works great for some people. For me, I have arthritis in my hands, so sometimes pumping it, especially the thicker part, can be a little bit more of like it hurts my hands. Also, I do find doing that sometimes it's hard to control exactly how much epoxy resin I am getting out of each pump. It honestly got a little bit more problematic for me, so I don't know, that did not last too long with me. The type of bottles that you're going to see other people use the most are the empty honey jar bottles. These are great. You can get them for very cheap online. I always buy, these are all from Amazon, everything is. With the honey jars, you can get them like in these smaller sizes, and you can get them all the way up to like these bigger sizes. Like these, they work good. My only issue that I ever had with them is this little silicone dispenser part. After a while, because I would reuse the bottles over and over again, I don't know if you can tell at all, but they eventually started to kind of get gummed up, and I found myself having to like poke something down in there to loosen it up. So I wouldn't say that these are good for like prolonged use. Typically get a few uses out of them, and then I felt like I was having to replace the lid. I typically like finding items where I can get many uses out of them. Probably the most common that you will see are the FIFA bottles. FIFA? I don't know, however you say that, where at the top it opens and you have the large opening there, and then at the bottom is this lid right here where it has that silicone stopper, and that's where your liquid comes out of. If you use these bottles, make sure you are not storing the silicone opening upside down. Make sure you store that up. Something that a lot of people will do because they don't want this to leak is they will actually glue this shut and just use this side for putting their resin in. So I highly recommend doing that if you are going to use these. I do like these bottles. The only issue with them was, again, this little silicone stopper piece. Eventually it would either get gummed up or it would just leak and it wouldn't really stop any liquid from coming out. A lot of people love them. So again, maybe you'll like them so much. That was just my experience. And there's this bottle, which is technically a condiment bottle for like ketchup and relish and stuff. This is my absolute favorite. I've been using these bottles for, I would say about 2 years now, and I love them. These are the ones that I will forever use. I like that it has the lid stopper on it. Also, this is not silicone. It's just open. It's a big opening, so I don't have to worry about it getting all gummed up at all. It lets out a good amount of epoxy, but not too much to where I can't control how much is coming out of it. Also holds a good amount of resin. I could store it upside down. That way, all of my resin just stays down here and I don't have to sit there going like this and waiting for that part A, which again is thicker, to fall down. I can just pull this out and open that up and I'm good to go. These are my favorite. Thankfully, none of these cost a lot. So if you try one of them out and you decide, I don't like that, then that's okay. You can just try one of the other ones. So we've gone over all of the different kinds of epoxy resin, storing it, things to look for with your resin. Hopefully everything made sense and you feel a little bit more prepared to work with your epoxy resin. We're gonna go over like the mixing part and all of that, bubbles and everything, in some of our later sections. You at least should be leaving this section with all of the basic knowledge that you need about epoxy resin. If you have any questions, as always, about anything that we talked about though, please let me know and I am happy to help out. But now that we know about epoxy resin, let's head over to our next section where we are going to talk all about mixing. See you there.